Hello, higher historians, and welcome to the last issue 2 lesson, which is on the final group for issue 2, which is Lithuanians. Similar to the other tasks that you have done for all of these different groups, we are looking for you to put together a mini fact file using this PowerPoint this week on the Lithuanians in Scotland. Again, you can do this any way you want to. I know some of you have been doing it in a different way for each group. That is totally fine, as long as you've got the information and you know the information and you can answer that in your head. Do you know why these people came to Scotland? Do you know where they lived, what they did, what their housing condition was like, and how the Scottish people got on with them? So those are the kind of headings that we're going for. So decide how you're doing it. I've absolutely loved seeing some of the things that you've sent, both me and Mr. Keir, for these, so keep up the good work with that and decide how you're going to do this and then get started. So the Lithuanians were basically one of the smaller groups that arrived in Scotland roughly between sort of 1870 and 1914. They really started to arrive in Scotland in sort of larger numbers roughly from the kind of 1890s onwards. 1 in 4 people left Lithuania between these periods to come to different places, and Scotland was one of the places that they came to. They tended to settle into industrial towns such as Lanarkshire, areas like Coatbridge, where they became involved in things like mining and iron and steel industry work. In Ayrshire, they were involved in the heavy industries, just like they were in Lanarkshire, and they lived in other towns as well in sort of West Lothian and the Fife area, where again there was mining and industry. Those were the biggest employers of the Lithuanian immigrants, so that's where they went to. Again, feel free to make a wee copy of this map if you want to for your notes, or if you want to leave some space to stick it down, print it out and stick it down, or wait till we go back to school and I will have copies and Mr. Keir will have copies of these maps for you to stick down. So heading number 1, reasons for moving. Make sure you put the heading, make sure it's really obvious that that's a heading, highlight it, underline it, colour it, whatever you want to do, and then put some of your information. So one of the major reasons why Lithuanian immigrants came to Scotland was because of Russification. The Russian Empire, which controlled countries like Lithuania at this point in time, used Russification as a way to basically keep people in Russian control. Basically what it meant was that the countries had to follow the Russian customs and the religious beliefs instead of whatever their own would be. They weren't even allowed to speak their own language, they had to speak Russian. So this forced quite a lot of Lithuanians to migrate purely so that they could be free from this kind of level of oppression. So for this bit, we need to know Russification is one of the things, and that countries under their control, like Lithuania, had to follow Russian customs and religious beliefs instead of their own, even had to speak Russian, and forced many Lithuanians to migrate so they could be free of oppression. So they're being forced to leave as a result of that. The second reason why they were leaving was due to religious discrimination. It forced a lot of them to leave purely because the Catholic Lithuanians and the Lithuanian Jews, which were the two predominant religious groups at this point in time in Lithuania, were oppressed by the Russian Orthodox Church. So both the Catholic Lithuanians and the Lithuanian Jews faced this same oppression, which was quite serious. So it made them obviously want to leave and go to Scotland or other places. So many of them moved to Scotland in order to get away from this particular discrimination and oppression. Another reason why a lot of them moved to Scotland was because they were being forced to join the Russian army, which they didn't want to do. So some of them emigrated purely to avoid being forced to join up or being conscripted into the Russian army. If they weren't there in the Russian Empire, then they couldn't join the army. Similar to some of the other groups, poverty and taxes also played a role in making people leave Lithuania, because they were moving to escape this level of extreme poverty in their home country and very high tax payments that they were having to pay in the Russian Empire. So poverty and taxes, again, key point. And we can see Lithuanians moved, that went a bit skew to escape the extreme poverty in their home country. This included very high tax payments. So poverty and taxes meant they would move as well. Okay, so those are all the reasons why they moved, but now we're thinking about where they lived and where they went to in particular. For most of the Lithuanians, like some of the other groups that we've looked at, the aim was actually to get to the United States. That's where they were really aiming to go to. Scotland was basically the stopgap point where they could earn enough money so that they could actually make the rest of the journey. So they weren't actually able to afford the full fare on the boat to the United States from where they were, so instead they came to Scotland, worked for a while and either stayed here for a while or permanently, or they made enough money and then continued their journey on to the United States. There were typically, as we've said, 2 different Lithuanian immigrant groups, and they both went to different places across Scotland depending on which group they actually were. So the Jewish Lithuanians were a smaller group, and they tended to move to places like Glasgow, so you need that whole yellow box there. And the Catholic Lithuanians were a larger group, and they moved to areas where there was mine work available, so places like West Lothian, Ayrshire, anywhere that they could work in smelting industries in the north and things as well, North Ayrshire, any place that they could work in mining work or these industries is where you would find them. So the full yellow box for the Jewish Lithuanians, and the Catholic Lithuanians were the larger group and moved to areas with mine work. I'll just give one example, like West Lothian, or to places to work in steel or smelting industries, and that's where you would find the Catholic ones. In particular, Bellshill in Lanarkshire, which you can see on the map here, which is it here, was particularly popular for Lithuanian immigrants purely due to the fact that there was a lot of mine and steelworks in that area. There was roughly about 5,000 to 6,000 living in that area. That's probably one of the biggest concentrations in Scotland. It actually got given the nickname Little Lithuania, which is an interesting point you can add in if you wish to your notes, but you don't necessarily need that exactly. So, new heading, employment. Make sure again that you've underlined it, it's different, it's standing out, and use the next couple of slides to fill it in. So most of the Lithuanian immigrants were Catholic, and they moved to areas with heavy industry work such as mines and metalwork, and that's what they did as their employment. It was miners or working within these heavy industries. Some Scottish companies even actually recruited them from Lithuania and paid for their passage and things like that. So for example, Baird's and Dixon's, they would recruit from Lithuania and pay for passage for people to come and work in their particular industries. It wasn't just men, even the women were able to work in the mines and things as well, so everyone in the family could work a job in the mines like that as well, but some of them did other things too. So those in particular who had been farmers in their homes also found work in agriculture, especially in Scotland during the harvest times. They were quite well thought of and well wanted for extra labour and extra work. So really we're talking about mining, heavy industries and things like that, and agricultural work, very similar to some of the other groups we've already looked at. The smaller group, the Jewish immigrants from the Lithuanians, they went to the cities with other Jewish communities, so Edinburgh, Glasgow, those places where we've already talked about there being these communities. And they tended to work in tailoring or other businesses like peddling, door-to-door, hawking, or tobacco shops or other things like that. They would work more within the same sort of employment areas as the Jewish groups would, rather than what the Catholic Lithuanians were doing in the mines and on this agricultural idea. Okay, so new heading then, housing conditions. Make sure again it's really obvious that it's a new part that we're looking at, and use the next couple of slides. So like many other immigrant groups, the Lithuanians tended to live close to their jobs, so just like the Irish Catholics did, that was kind of where they were. Wherever the mines were, they were living close by, with others of their communities and things like that as well. In places like the Gorbals in Glasgow, just like the Jewish communities and things like that, that's where you tend to find them. And as a result of this, and this is the key point here, their housing tended to be poor quality because it's in the poorer areas, it had poor sanitation, it was overcrowded as a result of the fact that there was all these different groups in there along with other Scottish people as well. So their housing conditions were particularly poor, purely because, again, they are one of the poorer groups that we're looking at, especially because they're living in these poorer areas like the Gorbals and things like that. So housing conditions were not particularly great for them. Personal identity then. New heading. There's not an awful lot about housing conditions there, but new heading for personal identity, and we're looking at what they tried to do to keep their identity alive and keep their sense of being Lithuanian alive in Scotland. Basically, for these people, their sense of national identity was actually vitally important. It was one of the most important things that they actually had. Due to the Russification basically taking that away from them, or forcing them to give up this identity, once they were actually in Scotland, it became a huge part of their heritage and important to them that they kept this personal identity as much as was physically possible. So while some of the other groups are very keen to keep it, it becomes vitally important to the Lithuanians that they do definitely do that. Despite this, in order to kind of fit in a little bit, some of the Lithuanians actually changed their surnames. So they would take their Lithuanian surnames and change them to more kind of acceptable sounding Scottish names, or at least UK names like Brown, Smith and Miller, rather than what they would have been originally. Some of them did this by choice because they felt it would help them fit in better, and then they could keep the rest of their kind of traditions and things alive. However, some of them were given these names by officials with no real agreement when they came over. They just had their name changed, and that's what they became known as. So we'll come back to that when we talk about the reactions from the Scottish people, but though they were trying to keep their identity and it was vitally important to them, they did try to fit in and assimilate a little bit. One of the other things that they did and was important to them was their language. Now, one of the things they did to try and assimilate a little bit and fit into Scottish society was that they learned and did speak the local languages while they were at work or while they were with these other people, but while they were at home they spoke in their native tongues. That was a huge part of what they wanted to do. So very similar to the Italians, but rather than speaking it everywhere, they learnt the local languages so that they could communicate effectively with others out and about, out with their communities, but within their own communities they spoke their own native tongues, and they kept that as a tradition that was really important to them. Like the Jewish people did, they also set up newspapers, so Lithuanian newspapers, like you can see one here, which not only helped them read in their own language and keep that connection, but it also got stories about what was happening back home, or back in Lithuania, and about life back there, so they could actually feel still connected to their home countries. And that was really, again, very important for them as part of their personal identity. In terms of businesses then, they set up businesses, insurance companies, shops, things like that, and there tended to be more kind of money being brought into the Lithuanian community as a result of this, which allowed them to keep the community quite sort of insular as well. They weren't really needing too much help from out with, but it also encouraged others within the community to support one another. So buy from a Lithuanian business rather than another outside business. Again, very similar to what we were seeing with the Italian and the Jewish groups as well. Try to stay within that community as much as possible to preserve that. In terms of socialising, social groups were also established to allow for things like dances, football teams, choirs, scouts, youth clubs, all those sort of things, again with this focus on being part of the Lithuanian community. Now, this was really important because it allowed customs and traditions to continue in these same traditional ways, and it gave the community as much chance as possible to be together rather than having to share in this with other people. Now, as you can imagine, and again when we come back to look at how the Scottish people reacted, this again would maybe look like they didn't want to mix with the Scots, but it is really more about them being able to embrace their culture and their personal identity when back home they'd had it taken away from them for so long due to Russification. So it was a really important point for them. They also continued to practice their religious beliefs, which was hugely important, and marriages and birth ceremonies were also conducted as closely as possible with the traditions that they would have done back home in Lithuania. And we'll come back to the religious bit in just a second. But the traditions that they actually had, the food, the sort of celebrations and things when they celebrated birth and life and marriages and death as well, would all be very traditional and would be really important that this was carried out in these traditional ways. And Scotland gave them the opportunity to do that. However, the community didn't maybe last quite as long as maybe some others did. When the First World War was declared in August 1914, this point meant that the Lithuanian men were then conscripted either into the British or the Russian armies. Now, some of them saw themselves as Russian, not Scottish, so not part of the British Army, and they left to fight in the Russian army instead for their own countries. Others refused to fight and were objectors, and they were sent back out of Scotland. And the Lithuanians that actually did choose to fight for Britain tended to then go on to become part of Scottish sort of tradition, and because they'd been fighting alongside the Scottish people, they now felt like they were Scottish more than they were anything else. And this left a little bit of a trail in terms of their heritage, but not very much of it. Their heritage more or less collapsed, and the level of community where they'd all been together collapsed, either because some of them had left to actually fight in the Russian army and had never come back to Scotland, either because they died or because they stayed where they were. Others refused and were sent back home, so again they couldn't come back to Scotland, and the Lithuanians that did fight for Britain tended to go on to fully assimilate into Scottish society, which meant that they did not continue all of their traditions. So ultimately, the personal identity was really, really strong for a very long time, up into the First World War, and then ultimately it did collapse, and it became very much a difficult thing to really see much of in Scotland today. Okay, so last section then, relations with the Scots. Make sure you've got a new heading here. As you can see by my Lego Man graph, because the Lithuanians actually only made up a really small proportion of the immigrant groups, the Irish being the sort of the biggest, then the Italians and the Jews, the Lithuanians are the smallest ones, and they only really were present in a very small number of areas across the country, they tended to face less discrimination or limited discrimination from the Scots compared to some of their counterpart groups. So we're going to just say here, just as points that you could take, because the Lithuanians only made up a small proportion of the immigrant groups, they tended to face limited discrimination. Okay, so those kind of 3 highlighted points there for your notes. However, despite me saying that, they did still face discrimination, and discrimination from the Scots in particular. It wasn't as much maybe as other groups because there wasn't as many of them, but they did still face it. One of the things that they were accused of was taking jobs. So many of them worked in the mines, obviously, and often were used as strike breakers when the Scottish people and others refused to work. And this led to a lot of anger from the Scottish miners because they felt like the Lithuanians, like the Irish as well, were taking their jobs, and this made them very, very angry. So again, a lot of hatred and discrimination happening as a result of this. In terms of wages, other Scots felt angry because they felt that the Lithuanian workers were working for much lower wages than the Scottish people actually would, and this led to a general fear amongst the Scots that the Scottish people would lose their jobs, or that actually all wages would be reduced for everyone, and that caused a lot of resentment between the Scottish people and the Lithuanians, which caused again a lot of tension and discrimination to happen. As you can see by this quote here, so a Lanarkshire newspaper in July 1900 said about them, "On the questions of labour, they are proving to be a menace to the well-being of our own people. Then again, speaking generally, they are most filthy in their habits of life, being a source of danger to the health of the community with their primitive ideas of order and cleanliness. They are fearfully intemperate in their habits and appeal to the knife. They are, in short, the most barbarous people, and in Bellshill we seem to have the very scum of their nation." So you can kind of see this idea that because they were quite poor, and again this is the notion that they would maybe be dressed a little bit shabbily because they couldn't afford as nice clothes, or they were arriving with very little, and they're living in these really poor areas, that they are unclean, that they're maybe going to be spreading disease and things like that, and that they are very aggressive and very violent. So the same sort of arguments that we're seeing in the other immigrant groups, which are causing a lot of fear from the Scottish people that they're going to be violent, they're going to start fighting and riots and violence in Scotland, so we have to do something about them. And for that reason, they tended to face a lot of discrimination from Scottish people who were just trying to put them back in their place in a lot of the time as well. Trade unions. Okay, there's a negative point and a positive point on that, so we're going to start with the negative points. The trade unions in general launched campaigns against immigrant workers, especially the Irish and the Lithuanians, describing them as an evil in Scottish society. Some politicians also campaigned against them actually being in Scotland, and said things like they didn't want to accept the paupers of Europe, basically these poor people coming in. So the trade unions generally, in this instance, discriminated against them because of this idea of them taking jobs and lowering wages, and were very much against them and part of the discrimination. However, that being said, eventually, as time goes on, many Lithuanians actually improved relations with the Scots by becoming involved in these labour campaigns to kind of improve the workplace, these trade union campaigns to improve workplace conditions and things like that, because they were working in these conditions as well. Because they were the strike breakers, when they start being the strikers, there isn't really very much employers can do about it, and this helps to improve the situation and improve the relationships with the Scottish people as well. This generally included setting up trade unions in places that there weren't any, or their own trade unions, or supporting strike action that were taken by the Scots by refusing to be strike breakers. So in some ways the trade unions did have a positive, and the relationship between the Scots and the Lithuanians did improve. Obviously, like other immigrant groups, the Lithuanians suffered quite a lot from poverty, which meant that they often came into Scotland with very little, aiming to travel on to the United States. Because of this, they lived in the poorer areas and caused resentment, firstly because they were seen to be coming in with nothing to contribute and taking from the charity available in Scotland, and also a lot of Scottish people were resentful about the fact that they were using Scotland as a stop-off point at all. Others were very unhappy that they were moving into these poor, overcrowded areas and making them even more overcrowded, and there was a lot of resentment adding up to that as well. Another quite negative aspect is stereotypes that they suffered from. A lot of the Lithuanians, like some of the other groups that we talked about, did suffer the same sort of negative stereotypes as each other. Due to their poverty, a lot of them were seen as dirty, which we've said, or diseased, drunkards. Generally, they were just very unwelcome, and a lot of Scottish people that had never met Lithuanian people, especially since they were in very concentrated areas around Scotland, did buy into this stereotype, and it caused a lot of hatred and anxiety and anger amongst Scottish people for what they perceived as the immigrant groups rather than what the immigrant groups really were like. So that again added to the hatred and the resentment between the groups. Another problem at this point in time was that the majority of Lithuanian immigrants were Catholic, and this led to conflict with the Protestant Scots, very similar to the same sort of conflict we're seeing with the Irish Catholics, especially when they're trying to hold on to their religious services and traditions, so they need to attend Catholic churches and things like that as well. So again, a lot of resentment due to this religious aspect with a Protestant country that felt that these immigrants, the Irish Catholic, the Italians, and now the Catholic Lithuanians, were trying to bring Catholicism back into the country, which they didn't want. This quote here is from John Miller, who obviously is giving a personal view of Lithuanians in Scotland. He's writing about his view at the time. And he says, probably the main thing they brought with them was their religion. To the Calvinistic Presbyterian country of Scotland, so the Protestant country of Scotland, they brought and diligently pursued the Roman Catholic faith. The traditional religious bigotry, particularly in the west of Scotland, meant that there were two reasons why the Lithuanians suffered ostracism and prejudice. So they were outcast and they were picked on. A, they were foreigners. So this is again back to this idea of stereotypes, taking the charity and things like that. And B, they were Catholic, back to this religious bit. Having suffered almost a century of Russian persecution, this treatment was nothing new to them, and they persevered in practising their faith. So maybe unlike some of the other groups who were not overly used to this level of persecution, the Lithuanians were, and they just continued regardless. So even though many of the Lithuanians had actually assimilated into Scottish life by the end of the First World War, many Lithuanian families were later forced to leave. When the British government withdrew support for any Lithuanian women and children whose husbands had either gone to war and been killed or had been killed and not come back, they refused to actually continue to pay war widows' pensions and things to them, so a lot of them were forced to go back to their original home countries because they couldn't afford to stay any longer in Scotland. Not all of them, but this withdrawal from support kind of showed how Scotland really was feeling about some of these immigrant groups. The ones that did assimilate were fine, the ones that did not, or they couldn't continue to work in Scotland without help from the government, were forced out, because that's how people were generally feeling at this point in time. After 1917, the British government also started to become worried that a communist revolution is going to happen in Britain the same way as it did in Russia, which obviously Lithuania is part of at this point in time, the Russian Empire. So this ideology clash between the potential communist Lithuanians and the capitalist Scots, and the economic cost of supporting them, made the British government very unlikely to actually support and accept many more Lithuanian immigrants into Scotland. So as a result of this, their presence in Scotland as one of the 5 main immigrant groups that we talk about has actually dwindled to the point that not everyone actually knows the Lithuanians did have such a big presence within Scottish society. So that's it for the Lithuanians. Make sure that you do your fact file, take a photo of it and upload a photo of any page of it to the team in the assignment tab for this week, and finish off the instructions for the week as well. Any questions or comments that you need to make, feel free to do that in your team or ask away and we will help any way we can.